Chapter 8, The Brown Pelican. You remember how I said that when things start to go pretty good, something usually happens to turn everything bad? I was starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe things don't always turn bad. What a chump I am. One Saturday in the middle of March, I figured out that my baseball, and you know which one I mean, my baseball that I had been keeping in the bottom drawer of the dresser underneath my socks and sweatshirt since I started wearing Joe Pepitone's jacket, my baseball was gone. Then on Monday morning, I found out that Joe Pepitone's jacket was gone too. When I asked my mother if she knew where my jacket was, she put her hands on the back of the kitchen chair and held on hard. Could have you left it at school? She said. I wore it for Saturday deliveries. At the library, I shook my head. On the stairs? No. She held on tighter to the chair. I didn't ask any more questions. Remember how I said something usually happens to turn everything bad? Remember how I said that? My jacket from Joe Pepitone. Then one day in late March, one of those days when the sun is sort of teasing you with the idea that maybe spring isn't so far away after all, the Tools and More hardware store was robbed again. Guess who the policeman came to question? Christopher said he hadn't been anywhere near the Tools and More hardware store. Lucas and I both said he hadn't been anywhere near the Tools and More hardware store. One of the policemen said, "Can we see your bike, son?" "Sure," said Christopher. We all went outside, my mother and me and Lucas and Christopher and the policeman. Christopher wheeled his Stingray up. "You're missing a pedal," said the policeman. "I lost it a few days ago," said Christopher. "Where did you lose it?" "If I knew that," said Christopher, "then it wouldn't be lost anymore." "Chris," said Lucas, low and steady, "you wouldn't have lost it anywhere near the hardware store." "No, I wouldn't have lost it anywhere near the hardware store because I haven't been anywhere near the hardware store since I don't even know when." The policeman took a bicycle pedal out of his pocket. He slid it onto the rod of Christopher's bike. It slid on easily. "I found this over at Tools and More," said the policeman, looking up at my mother around the back. Then he turned to Christopher. "Looks like a match to me." It did. We could all see it was the right pedal. Christopher went with the policeman. I went to the Ballard paper mill to find my father. I didn't want to run into Mr. Ballard, not right now. So I went out onto the floor looking for my father, but no one seemed to know where he was. He wasn't at his station, where he was supposed to be, and he wasn't packing, and he wasn't loading trucks. Finally, one of the loaders said I should try outside past the loading dock. Maybe he was there. And he was, taking a break, I guess, smoking a cigarette with Ernie Echo. I told him about Christopher, and the funny thing was, my father looked straight at Ernie Echo. It was the first thing he did, look straight at him. Ernie Echo shrugged. My father threw his cigarette away, and we went in and across the floor. "Sweatix," someone called, but my father never even let on that he heard. We went across the floor and out the front door and into his pickup and on into Marysville. It took 2 hours to get Christopher out on bail, and in that time he was fingerprinted and his picture taken for police records, and a policeman tried to get him to confess, but he kept saying he didn't have anything to confess and he didn't know anything about the hardware store, and no, he didn't have any idea who did. And when he wouldn't confess, they put him into a cell for the rest of the 2 hours, and when he came out, he smelled like throw up. A sergeant said there would be a hearing. They'd let us know when. And in the meantime, he looked hard at Christopher. In the meantime, if Christopher happened to remember what went on that night and where all the stuff was, maybe things would go a whole lot easier for him. Christopher didn't say anything. We went out into the pickup. My father got in the front, and I got in the front, and Christopher got in the back. Maybe because he smelled like throw up. We drove home slowly, but word got around Marysville fast. Things at Washington Irving Junior High School did not go well the next day. Every time someone looked at me, the look said, "I know." In geography, I didn't draw the chapter review map of Northern Africa because I didn't read the chapter on Northern Africa. In world history, I told Mr. McElroy, "Who really cares about the creation stories of the Aboriginal tribes of Eastern Australia?" In English, we were still on the Introduction to Poetry unit. And I'm not lying, if I ever meet Percy Bysshe Shelley walking down the street in Marysville, I'm going to punch him right in the face. I cut advanced algebra, Coach Reed can chart his own presidential physical fitness charts, and in Mr. Ferris's class, I wasn't so all-fired excited that the command ship and the lunar module of Apollo 9 had separated and flown 100 miles apart and then come back together, just like they would for the real moonshot, which was now really going to happen, said Mr. Ferris. He put his hand on Clarence's head. It was the first time astronauts had transferred from one space vehicle to another while in space. He said, "Terrific." The next morning, Principal Petey was waiting for me when I got to school. He told me to come by his office after Mr. Barber's class. Mr. McElroy already knew I'd be late for world history, and I'd better not try to get out of this. He said, "Terrific. Do you know what it feels like reviewing North Africa's geography when you still haven't read about while waiting to go to the principal's office, which you'd better not try getting out of? You wish there was room on the moonshot." I waited for my half hour, and when I finally got into Principal Petey's office, he looked like he wished there was room on the moonshot too. For me. "So," he said, "you're up to your old tricks." Lucas, the old Lucas, might have pointed out that cutting Mrs. Verne's class was a new trick, but I still get it. I didn't say anything. "First PE, then algebra. Advanced algebra." I said. "Not anymore," he said. "Principal Petey does not give a student who lacks the discipline to go to assigned classes the privilege of attending advanced classes. Did you know that the brown pelican's beak is about as long as its whole body? It's huge. It looks like it could open wide and fit in a whole lot, like a principal. Do you understand that all actions have consequences? That's what Principal Petey is trying to teach you here," said Principal Petey. "The pelican is standing mostly on one leg. The other is lying like it doesn't care on the branch, like the pelican doesn't believe that actions have consequences, which he doesn't. You are assigned 3 days of after-school detention," said Principal Petey, "starting this afternoon. Principal Petey will be calling your home to explain why you'll be late. The brown pelican, the way he looks at you, the eye, he knows he's... Are you listening to Principal Petey?" "Noble." Principal Petey stood up. "Yes," I said, "I'm listening. Do you want to explain to Principal Petey why you cut Mrs. Verne's class?" I didn't see anything. "Douglas, is it because of your brother? If you wanted to draw the brown pelican, I'm not lying, it wouldn't be easy. There's something like 9 or 10 rows of feathers, maybe 11, maybe 12, and they're all shaped differently, and they all layer over each other, and the composition is fabulous. He's standing on this big old branch that's starting to decay, but it's still putting out leaves. The brown pelican is right in the middle of the picture, balancing on this one leg, and it doesn't seem like a body with so much beak in the front could be balanced, but it is. It looks like it should tip forward. All the movement, you might remember, relies on that kind of tension. But he wasn't moving. He was balanced just right. It would take a while to figure out how Audubon did that." Principal Petey sat back down. "If you're not even going to look at Principal Petey, he can't help you," he said. I looked at him. "My brother didn't do anything," I said. He sighed, like it was him that was in some sort of pain. "Principal Petey has spoken with the police about this," he said. "Your brother stole merchandise from the Tools and More hardware store. He almost certainly was the one who robbed the store last fall as well. He probably is also the one who robbed Spicer's Deli last fall." "You don't know anything," I said. "The sooner you face the facts—" "Here's a fact," I said. I might have been yelling, but I'm not sure. "That bird belongs back in the book it was stolen from." Principal Petey looked sort of startled. He turned around to the brown pelican, and then he looked back at me. "That plate was a gift from the Education Committee when Principal Petey assumed the responsibilities of being the principal of this school," he said. "It was not stolen. And Douglas, it has nothing at all to do with the problem you and Principal Petey are talking about." "I have an idea," I said. Principal Petey sighed again. "When the police figure out who the thief really is, and it isn't my brother, then you have to give the bird back to the library." Principal Petey considered this for a long time. Then he nodded like he'd decided something, and stood. "All right," he said. "All right, Principal Petey will take a chance. He will do that. Meanwhile, you, Douglas, have to promise to attend all of your classes, without missing a single one. And I get to stay in advanced algebra." He considered this, then nodded again. "But you still have 3 days of after-school detention," he said. I held out my hand. He held his hand out. We shook. Over us both, the noble brown pelican watched, keeping his balance like it was no trouble at all. I served after-school detention with Miss Cowper. She gave me 3 more poems by stupid Percy Bysshe Shelley that she was sure I would enjoy. "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert," she said. "Near them, on the sand, I really will punch him right in the face." It was late in the afternoon when I finally got out of school on the third day of detention, and even though it was a pretty nice spring day still, I was a whole lot colder than I wanted to be because if you remember, I didn't have Joe Pepitone's jacket anymore, which is why I think Mr. Ballard stopped when he saw me while driving past. He leaned across the seat and rolled down his window. "Hey, my partner," he called. I waved. "Get in," he said. "I'll drive you home, unless you have time for a few horseshoes." I got in. I looked out the window. We drove a few blocks. "Horseshoes always help me think things out," Mr. Ballard said. Another block. The dump came in sight. "I guess I have time," I said. Mr. Ballard turned toward the paper mill. Mr. Ballard was keeping the horseshoes in his office until it got warmer, so we went in together and he got them from behind the door. You should have seen the orchids blooming with all that sunlight coming in. And we went down to the horseshoes pits. The ground was still pretty soggy from the winter, and the sand around the stakes was all wet through. "It'll be a practice round," said Mr. Ballard. I threw the first shoe, way over. He threw the next one. It clanged the post and bounced off. I threw the next shoe, way over. He threw the next one, a leaner. And that's pretty much how it went until it got too cold and we went back to the mill. Here are the stats for that practice round. Shoes way over, about 50 for me, 2 for Mr. Ballard. Shoes thrown short, none for me, 4 for Mr. Ballard. One pointers, 3 for me, about 50 for Mr. Ballard. Leaners, none for me, 4 for Mr. Ballard, which he said was unusual. Ringers, none for me, which he said was unusual. 23 for him, which wasn't unusual. "Did you have a good game?" said Mrs. Stenson when we brought the horseshoes back up. "It was a practice round," Mr. Ballard said. He went into his office and set the horseshoes behind the door. Then he came back out. I was standing by the window, all that sunshine. Mr. Ballard stood next to me. He picked up the orchid, put it back, and chose another that was in fuller bloom. It was all purple and white and yellow, like some artist had designed an impossible bloom without worrying about composition, like he went wild and let it all go. "This is for your mother," he said, and handed it to me. And suddenly, I felt like I was going to cry, right there in the middle of the office of the president of Ballard Paper Mill, just start bawling like I was 4 years old or something, holding this orchid for my mother. "It's all right," said Mr. Ballard. "Things will work out." I looked up at him. Things always do. I didn't want to tell him that he was wrong. I had seen the black-backed gull. I didn't want him to start crying too. "I'll drive you home," he said. "Give me a minute." He went back into his office. Mrs. Stenson smiled at me, which was probably her trying not to laugh, me standing there about to cry, holding a flower. Then Mr. Ballard came back out of his office. He handed me a jacket. "This doesn't fit me anymore," he said. "I'd be glad to have someone use it." I took it. You won't believe what kind of jacket it was. And no, it wasn't a Yankee jacket, even though a Yankee jacket would have been terrific. It was a flight jacket. I'm not lying, a flight jacket. Dark leather lined on the inside with the soft flannel stuff, deep pockets, turned up collar, a flight jacket like you'd wear if you were an astronaut on vacation walking around Marysville before you were going to blast off to the moon. "Try it on," he said. I did. "It's a little big," said Mrs. Stenson. "It's perfect," said Mr. Ballard, and he looked at me with eyes like the brown pelicans. I drove home with him wearing the flight jacket, carrying the orchid. I don't think I need to tell you what my mother did when she saw that orchid. But I do need to tell you what Lucas said when I told him that I had a new flight jacket. "Would it fit me?" "Not in a million years," I said. He started to laugh. "I guess you're right," he said, and laughed some more. You know how good it was to hear Lucas laugh? It was even better than wearing this flight jacket, which, unless Joe Pepitone's jacket turns up, is the only thing I own that hasn't belonged to some other sweatic before me. On Saturday morning, Mrs. Mason said that my flight jacket looked snazzy, and she wondered if someone who wore such a snazzy jacket would still like a chocolate donut, or if he was too grown up for that. I said I would love a chocolate donut, and she gave me a glass of cold milk so I could dunk it. Mr. Loeffler said my new flight jacket reminded him of something, and he went up into his attic so he could find it while I brought the groceries in. I waited, and when he came back, he was wearing, I'm not lying, a flight jacket. Its brown leather was all creased and soft, and it had a yellow woolly collar and yellow woolly stuff at the ends of the sleeves. "Mr. Loeffler," I said, "that's terrific." "Lieutenant Loeffler," he said, and pulled the jacket trim around him. Not bad at all after 35 years. He was right, it wasn't bad at all. So I brought my feet together, my hand up, and I saluted him. Just kidding around. But you know what? He got this serious look on his face, like we weren't just kidding around in his kitchen. And he snapped his legs together and got straighter than I had ever seen him, and he whipped his arm up and saluted back. His hands weren't shaking. Not at all. It sort of startled me. Not the salute, but because of his eyes. I think you can probably guess what they look like. Ben, Polly, Joel, Davy, and Phronsie loved the flight jacket. They all wanted to try it on, and I let them, even though Joel almost disappeared in it, and Davy and Phronsie could both have worn it together and still had plenty of room. Mrs. Windermere said my flight jacket made me look like Errol Flynn. Who? I said. Errol Flynn, the actor. At least he thinks he's acting. I shook my head. Never mind, she said. I've been trying to write Mr. Rochester's dialogue all day, and every time he speaks he sounds like Errol Flynn. It's driving me crazy. She looked at the packages of groceries I was putting away. What kind of ice cream did I order? She said. Pistachio. I said. Pistachio? I took it out of the grocery bag and showed her. I hate pistachio, she said. I would never have ordered pistachio. It's green. That's what Mr. Spicer packed. Mrs. Windermere raised an eyebrow. Skinny delivery boy. Mr. Spicer is not infallible. I shrugged. She looked at the pistachio ice cream. Go get 2 spoons, she said, and take off that jacket. I don't want to write with Errol Flynn, and I don't want to eat ice cream with him either, even if it is only pistachio. When I got to the library that afternoon, Mr. Powell and Lil were already upstairs, and Lil had a stack of books that she said she got out for both of us because we were supposed to be working on a project about New Zealand for Mr. Barber, and did I remember that we were partners and the project was due in 2 weeks? I'm not a chump, I said I remembered. Then Mr. Powell said I looked great in my flight jacket. Lil said I looked great too, only the way she said it made it sound a whole lot better than the way Mr. Powell said it. She smiled and opened up one of the books on New Zealand. You know how pretty someone can be when she opens a book, especially if she has brown hair the color of the pelican's feathers? Mr. Sweattick, said Mr. Powell, and we got to work. Balance can be achieved in 2 different kinds of conditions, said Mr. Powell, stable and unstable. Stable and unstable, I said. Let's say that you are going to draw Lil sitting by that table, working on the project that you better get going on as soon as we're done here. Let's say that we draw the table with its legs on the floor, and Lil with her feet on the floor, and maybe the drawing will be wider than it is high so we can show the whole table. That painting would be stable. Why? Because nothing would look like it could fall over, I said. Exactly. A stable composition is fixed firmly to the ground. So, in an unstable composition, I could have Lil floating away to New Zealand. Lil smirked at me. Yes, said Mr. Powell. What else? Maybe the table could be slanted and the right legs up in the air. In such a painting, do you see how much more tension there would be? Said Mr. Powell. You don't know where anything is headed. The brown pelican is stable, I said. And after a moment, Mr. Powell said, yes, he is. He is, you know. It might look like he isn't, standing mostly on this one leg on a curved branch that looks pretty rotten, but he is. He wouldn't move if a hurricane blew in. That's what makes him so noble. I drew the fork-tailed petrels again from scratch because that's what Mr. Powell said I needed to do. They weren't smiling, the water was going every which way beneath them, and the wind was a storm blowing so bad they could hardly control their wings. You sure can't tell where they're headed, said Mr. Powell, and he was right. Afterward, I got to work on the New Zealand project, alone, since Lil left because she had a stomachache. But she made sure to leave all the books with bookmarks at the right places. She could hardly wait to see what I came up with, she said from the stairs. Terrific. The first day of April was a gray and half-rainy day that still thought it was early March. After school, Lil and I walked over to the Ballard paper mill to bring Mr. Ballard a note from my mother about the orchid and to maybe throw a few horseshoes. You know how good a flight jacket feels on a cold day like this? You know how good it felt walking with Lil to throw horseshoes, even though it was half rainy? Even though everyone in stupid Marysville thought Christopher was. I went into Mr. Ballard's office and he was talking with Mrs. Stenson, and when he saw us, he called my partner, and I introduced him to Lil, and they shook hands. I gave him my mother's note, and he said thanks, and he hoped my mother liked the orchid. I told him that she turned it every morning in the sun so that it would grow evenly, and when she watered it, it was like she was feeding a baby. He laughed and asked if we wanted to throw some horseshoes, and Lil said we did, and I got the horseshoes from behind the door, and by the time I turned around, Lil was picking out an orchid for herself, and the sun had come out suddenly and was throwing everything it could through that window, and it was all landing on Lil, and she was smiling and brushing her hair back the way she does, and being kind of embarrassed because Mr. Ballard was giving her this orchid that was almost as beautiful as she was, a pale purple one with white just barely on its edges. She looked at me and smiled, holding the orchid. What do you think? She said. Beautiful, I said. We left the orchid and went out of the office and across the mill floor. The sun was still shining when we opened the door, and some of the people on the floor gasped when they saw the light pouring through. "Leave it open," someone said, and we did. We went outside, and there, standing against the wall, I guess on another break, were my father and Ernie Echo. They were smoking and laughing like something was really, really funny. The funniest thing in the whole world. And Ernie Echo was wearing... My father said, "What are you doing here?" I didn't even look at him. Ernie Echo was wearing my Yankee jacket from Joe Pepitone. Lil and I went back inside. We walked across the floor. I left the horseshoes outside Mr. Beller's office door. Lil took my hand. "You better go in and get your orchid," I said. "I don't..." "Go ahead," I said. She waited for a bit. Then she bent down to pick up the horseshoes and went on inside. I was gone before she came out. I didn't want her to see me. I ran hard, really hard, until I hurt so bad that it didn't matter that the world was so unstable. And it didn't even matter that maybe I was wrong. When the hurricane blew in, it would throw the brown pelican as far as it wanted to. Ernie Echo didn't come to supper that night. My mother asked if I'd seen Mr. Ballard and given him the note. I said yes. The orchid was in the middle of the table, and every so often she would reach across and turn it so that she could look at it from a different angle, like she was studying its balance. I didn't say much the whole meal. Neither did my father. At dessert, Lucas said he thought it was about time he should be looking for work. Christopher said he could help him get around if he could cut school. My mother slapped at him. And Christopher said he should get credit for trying, and Lucas told him he'd get by, and Christopher wasn't allowed to miss a day, not a single day. And Christopher said, "How come?" And Lucas got real quiet and said, almost whispered, "Because you're not going to Vietnam. You're going to college." And my father said there wasn't any way in the whole world he was going to pay for that, and Lucas said that was why he was getting a job, and my father said he wasn't going to get a job because what could he do? Which pretty much ended dessert. There's a kind of angry quiet that can lie down over a house. Maybe there are some houses, like the Daughteries, that have never known it. That house probably hasn't ever had a quiet day, but in the dump, angry quiet was an old friend. And he moved in again. No one talked because we all wanted to scream. Lucas started going out every morning to look for work. You know how many people in stupid Marysville want to hire someone who doesn't have legs? 0. He went out in that stupid wheelchair every day the first week of April. Every day. He wheeled himself up and down every street in Marysville that had some place where someone might get work. You know how hard it is to go down a stupid curb in a wheelchair? You know how hard it is to get back up on the other side before a light turns red again? You know how many stores even have doors that Lucas could figure out how to open while sitting in a wheelchair? Here's what they told Lucas. "I don't think you could do this job from a wheelchair. Sorry, but I couldn't put up with a contraption like that rattling around here all day. It'd be too hard for you, son. The aisles are too small for your wheelchair. You'd never manage. Frankly, we don't want our customers feeling sorry about something when they walk in. People who know they're going to feel sorry don't come back to the store." And more like that. But Lucas went out every day. I guess being in a wheelchair can be pretty unstable. But Lucas isn't. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a house where everything is going along just fine when back at your own house, Lucas is going out every day for nothing and Ernie Echo is wearing your jacket? That's what it was like the next Wednesday night when I went to the Daughteries on short notice again, and Mrs. Daughtery said, "Thanks for coming, Doug," and told me there were marshmallow brownies for me. After the kids were in bed, but they had already had theirs and they didn't need any more sugar, which I could tell because Francie and Davy had me by the legs and Joel was trying to push me over and Polly and Ben were waiting to see if I was going to fall over so they could pounce. "Don't hurt him," Mrs. Daughtery said, and Mr. Daughtery said I was big enough to take it, and he laughed. And that was the cue, I guess, for Ben and Polly because I was down on the floor before Mr. and Mrs. Daughtery were out the door, and they were tickling me until I agreed to play bloody, bloody murderer, and they all went screaming to hide. When I found Davy, I tagged him, and he became a bloody, bloody murderer too. And then we went into the kitchen and found Polly, and she became a bloody, bloody murderer too. And then we went, well, I guess you can figure out the rules. And after that, we all had some cold milk, and I let them have just a tiny piece of marshmallow brownie. And then we started in on the reading, which, as you might remember, takes a while. Francie had a new book, and I didn't care what anyone says, elephants don't wear clothes. Davy made me read about this kid who had a name like Tick-Tock Tiddly-Wink Tembe, something that I could never read right, and Joel just about died laughing when I tried, and you couldn't do it either. Joel had a book about Ben that he thought was great because he had a brother Ben, and this Ben could figure out how to jump to the top of the castle, and could I guess how he did it? You can't jump to the top of a castle, I said, and Joel started to laugh and laugh because you can too, so go ahead and read it. Polly had this book about a house in a forest where Laura lives with Pa and Ma and her sisters. You'd be surprised how good this was, especially considering that nothing happens. And Ben had this book about a pig that went to Florida, and it turned out to be funnier than it sounds, which was good because there are a whole lot of books with this pig. Could I believe it? And Ben wanted to read every single one. Terrific. So by the time the pig got on his way, and all the kids got to bed, it was probably later than the Daughteries would have wanted it to be, but it usually was, and I was sitting in the upstairs hall listening to everything settle into that kind of sweet and beautiful breathing. Mrs. Verne had given us more quadratic equations than she should have for advanced algebra, and then 4 problems about 2 men who were driving in different directions at different speeds for different amounts of time, and who cares how far apart they could get before one of them ran out of gas, and then the breathing wasn't sweet and beautiful anymore. It was wheezing. From Joel's room, breathing like the breather couldn't get enough air. I stood up, wheezing hard and kind of desperate. I went in, turned on the light. Joel was looking at me, and his eyes... Oh goodness, I had seen the black-backed gull. I run to his bed, and he tries to breathe. He can hardly get anything in. His eyes get bigger. He tries drawing more air in. Hardly anything. I run into the hall. I call home. Christopher answers. I tell him to get over here now and hang up. I run into Joel. Hardly anything. Run to Ben's room and tell him I have to take Joel to Dr. Bottom's house and he should stay awake with the others until Christopher comes. Is it his asthma, he says? I don't know, I say. I run into Joel. He is standing by the bed with his back arched, dragging in air, rubbing at his chest, starting to cry, sweaty. Ben runs in. Where's your inhaler, Joel? Joel, where's your inhaler? Joel looks at me like he thinks he can do something. Ben starts tearing the bed apart, and then he runs to the nightstand and pulls out the drawer and empties it on the bed. I can't find it, he yells. Joel, where is your inhaler? Polly comes and stands by the door. She looks at Joel. Is he going to die? She says. I wrap him up in a blanket. I carry him downstairs and out the door. Joel puts his arms around me tight, like he is fighting a bloody, bloody murder. Start to run. Do you know what it feels like running in the night holding this kid who's crying but he can't cry because he can't breathe, and you're running and you don't know if it's your sweat or his, and he's staring at you, afraid and believing in you, but you're not believing in you, and if the Bottoms aren't home, what are you going to do then? Running in the night, running in the night, running in the night, running. Their lights are on. I kick at the door as hard as I can. Again, again, again. Joel drags another breath now. Joel drags another breath, weaker now, again. The door opens, Dr. Bottom, I hope. One look at us, and he reaches out and takes Joel. Otis, get the shower running, hot as you can get it, now. Carries Joel into the living room and looks at me and points to another room where he wants me to get something, and then sees that I probably can't figure out what he wants. And he tells me to hold Joel, and he runs, and then he comes back with this thing, and he hollers, here! And he holds it out, and Joel grabs it and holds it to his mouth and pumps. And pumps, and pumps, and pumps. And I can hear the air dragging in, but it's less draggy. And Joel, who is starting to turn a color that no human being should turn, but I didn't want to tell you about that until you knew he was going to be all right, Joel looks at me, and he smiles. Keeps pumping. Breathing. Breathing. Sweet, beautiful breathing. Beautifully. Dr. Bottom carries him to the stairs. Then he looks back at me. I'm going to bring him up into the steam for a bit, he says. He looks down at Joel, breathing, watching me. Do you know what he's telling you? I shook my head. Dr. Bottom smiled. I think you do. I did. It's the same thing that Mr. and Mrs. Daughtery told me when they got to Dr. Bottom's house and saw Joel asleep on the couch, covered with 2 Afghans being watched over by Dr. Bottom and Otis and me. And by the way, Otis made the coffee for us that night, and for the record, it was a whole lot stronger than Mrs. Windermere's. I guess he was used to making coffee that helps people stay awake. Maybe he's a good guy too. Mrs. Daughtery stayed the night at Dr. Bottom's house so she would be there when Joel woke up. Mr. Daugherty drove me home. Then he went back for Christopher and drove him home. When Christopher came up into our bedroom, I was still awake and sitting on his bed. So how did it go? I said. This is what he told me. Piece of cake. Really? Really. They didn't. Hey, I'm not some chump babysitter. I told them all to go to bed, and they did. That's it. Get off my bed and go to sleep. Shut up, or I'm coming over there and will kick you both to death. You can guess who said that. I went by the Daugherty's house the next morning. Joel was great, and here's what Mrs. Daugherty told me. When they got home, they saw Ben and Polly holding Christopher down on the floor, and Davy and Phronsie were beating him around the head with one hand and holding a marshmallow brownie with the other. And Christopher was begging for mercy, and when he saw the Daughertys, he picked up Davy and Phronsie, who were still beating at him, but not letting go of their marshmallow brownies, and he told Mr. and Mrs. Daugherty where Joel was, and they got into the car right away and hadn't even thought about telling the children to go to bed. Piece of cake. After school, Mr. Daugherty was waiting with his patrol car. When he saw me, he waved, told me to come over. He opened the side door and I got in, and he said he was going to drive me home to thank me, and he put the siren on, and off we went. And here's what Mr. Daugherty told me. The night before, when he got back to the house to pick up Christopher, after he'd brought me home, my brother was in a heap of little Daughertys all asleep on top of him, and he was asleep too and still holding the book about elephants who wear clothes. I'm not lying. That's what Mr. Daugherty told me. Don't tell my brother I know this. Don't tell him that I know he's not a chump babysitter. And don't tell him that I think he may be what the brown pelican is.